Welcome to the Corpse Club, the official podcast of dailydead.com. I am one of your co-hosts, Derek Andersen, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by fellow co-host Bryan Christopher. Thank you for joining me today, Bryan.
You are so welcome, Derek. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, I didn't force you into this at all. This is
there's definitely no, I'm not being held against my will. We don't have to do like a blink twice if you're in trouble kind of thing, which wouldn't work anyway because we're on a podcast. So
that is true. It's not like our last episode, which was kind of a dual episode where we had a Phantasm live stream. So you did have that option, listeners, to see us in action if you tuned in for that. Otherwise, we had the audio. So we were celebrating Bryan's birthday eve. And now we're on the other side of Bryan's birthday, and the party continues on this episode with just the two of us, though.
Yeah, the 40-year-old train has left the station. I got one more year before I got hit by that sucker.
At least it's the year that you can say you're 39 and you actually mean it instead of like pretending
being
that
39 12 times. Yeah.
Remember the good old days when it was 29? That was the number, right? And now it's like
29.
It really is, though. I mean, we're able to lifespans hopefully are continuing to go up if we're lucky enough. But so we'll just keep that in mind as we get into our 40s eventually here. But
also, I do want to mention, if anybody did miss the watch party last week, you did miss one hell of a quadruple duck face. From all four of us. It was me, Derek, Jonathan James, and Scott Drummond. And then, of course, Scott being Scott, decided to take it like 3 steps further and just started doing like lines from Phantasm while doing the duck face. It was a sight to behold.
Yeah, he was, I believe, doing the narration for Michael Baldwin's character. So
yeah, he was doing some Mike dialogue, and it was something.
Especially because we were watching it on mute, so we had the subtitles, and so you don't really hear anything, but all of a sudden Mike's character said something and it's Scott's voice in your ear in this like really falsetto kind of tone. And it's still like moments from that. There's a couple lines that Scott had in that episode that are like still make me crack up like a week later. So, and one of our listeners actually recorded like a 10-second clip, so I can go back and watch and relive those moments over and over.
They got the duck face. Wicked Kitten 13, I believe. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know how much duck face we're going to get into on this episode, but we'll play it by ear. But we are looking at one of the shows that you and I have been watching kind of at different points in time over the last couple months, as a lot of people have, is The Last of Us TV series, which we've talked about a little bit on the podcast in earlier episodes. It seems like event television right now, where like everybody, even people that like didn't have HBO Max, like they got it for this show. And like, it's definitely that water cooler show. It's kind of like, it almost takes you back in time a little bit, where you feel like it's that standard of Sunday night television that you used to have. And, before we had like the entire season go live at the same time. But it's been really, really interesting. And I know you are not completely caught up on it, and I'm not completely caught up either, but we've made our way a little deeper into The Last of Us.
Yes, we're plugging away at it. And yeah, I definitely agree. The Last of Us is like, I don't know, it actually kind of reminds me of the heyday of The Walking Dead, back when like everybody was watching that show. I hope to God, like to the gods, that The Last of Us doesn't last 11 seasons, which I honestly think would probably be about 8 seasons too long. I don't see this going that long. But I guess at this point, they only have 2 video games to work off of. So I don't know, like, either they're going to take it and run with it in this whole new direction, which they've already started doing. I think we're going to talk about that tonight. Like they've done their own thing with it, but I don't know. This doesn't seem like the type of show where they're just going to try and like milk it for all it's worth. Like, frankly, I think The Walking Dead did.
Yeah, that's the thing with, and I'm someone who watched The Walking Dead all the way to the end, the main series, and it does remind you, like, I think you're spot on. It reminds you of like The Walking Dead season like 2, 3, 4, where it was like it made people who weren't into horror, and especially like the level of gore that you got with like a zombie show, it brought that into the mainstream. And shows like The Last of Us probably owe a lot of debt to The Walking Dead just for kind of paving the way and making it like, here's, like, see, horror can be like a TV series and be super popular and resonate with people. But also, yeah, I think sometimes like when you look at the story, you kind of want to do what's organic for the story rather than like the viewership or the money and that kind of thing. So but obviously, I've always enjoyed aspects of The Walking Dead, no matter what part of the show it was in. But definitely, like, it feels to me like the meat of it was really those early to mid seasons. So this taps into that really, really nicely. But also, like, it's weird too, because now, like back then when The Walking Dead came out, it was like trying to convince people to give zombies a chance. And now I feel like we're on the other side of that, where it's zombie fatigue, and you're
Can
like,
still be interesting, we promise. Yeah. It's it was actually funny that you mentioned that like the gore that The Walking Dead brought to it, because that's on basic cable. The Last of Us is on HBO, where they really have free reign to do what they want. I feel like this isn't nearly as gory as The Walking Dead, but somehow is so much more brutal.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Just the way, because you're not seeing a lot of, even when like the zombies or like the fungi creatures or whatever you want to call them, like even when they like kind of swarm people and they are like biting them, and that it's really not about like eating them, it's more about like spreading the fungus and spreading like this like organism and using the body. So it's like they don't even really want to destroy the body as much, but it's also like more, it's almost in a way more horrifying than getting eaten alive, because it's like it's just using you so much. It's like now you are a vessel. And I think we saw that like with what happened, and kind of a spoiler alert for like the first couple episodes, but kind of what happened with Tess in like episode 2, where it's like the zombie is almost like kissing her, and you see like the fungus coming out, and like she knows at that moment, if she doesn't blow herself up, that she's just going to become another like cog in this giant machine. And
I guess
it's unsettling.
Spoiler alerts, by the way, up through I think episode 4.
Yeah.
Derek's. I think we're going to take some deep dives, especially into episode 3. Yeah, it's the fungus thing actually reminds me of it's very kind of a similar process to the way the zombie outbreak works in the movie The Girl with All the Gifts. I don't know if you've seen that one, the one from the UK, which was a similar thing where people are getting taken over by this fungus, and there's kind of like a collective notion to it. And it's, the fungus is perpetuating itself using human beings as a host. So it's like a similar mechanism. I think there are, some parallels into some of the conversations that are being had with that, just in terms of like, to what degree, like how the kind of horrible lengths to which we're willing to go in order to survive as a species. That whole sequence is really chilling, where they're doing that flashback to the country of origin. I forget which country it was, but they're talking to this very well-renowned scientist, and they let her know, like, hey, this person seems to be infected by this fungus. They've started attacking people. There's at least like 3 other people. What do we do? And she's like, bomb everything. And it's just like, and you can tell it's not like she's not saying it callously. Like, it breaks her to say that, but it's like she doesn't know any other way to stop this. And eventually it doesn't even, whatever they do doesn't do the trick. So you just kind of, that's the world we're living in The Last of Us is like, and it's, I'm sure there's complaints about how, this isn't necessarily breaking new ground in terms of zombie stories being more about like how horrible human beings are to one another than it is about the zombies and things like that. But I think in this case, they're still finding interesting things to do with it.
Yeah, it definitely feels like they're doing it in a different way. It's very straightforward. It's not really like overly dramatic, but it's there's a realism there that is really frightening. Like the whole cold opening, like in the 60s with the talk show, and he's talking about, well, what if the planet were to get slightly warmer? And then you're just looking around like, oh crap, that's us, you know?
Absolutely.
But it's but there's just a straightforwardness to like the horror, like even the night when everything starts to happen and the infected start to spread, like there's just like they pull away from when the neighbors attack like the other neighbor and they're driving away, and you can kind of see like in the background the neighbors getting attacked, but you don't really like they don't really hold on that, but it's just kind of like in the background. There's just a lot of like they do the little details really well, and the characters themselves just feel so authentic, and it doesn't feel like they're posturing or anything like that. They're just trying to like get by, like they're trying to get by before the apocalypse and after the apocalypse. And it's just like a really, there's like a gritty realism there that just feels really authentic. And I think that's why the game worked so well too, is that it was almost like, you might not like how brutal this story gets, but we're not doing it just to be brutal. Like that's just what this world is. Like we're not rubbing your face in it, but we're not going to look away either.
Like everyone lives in shades of gray in this show. Up to and including, one of the main characters, Pedro Pascal's character, Joel, is, you see very early what broke him, in the outbreak. He, spoiler alert, he loses his daughter. And so like a lot of, I feel like a lot of shows or movies would kind of do the thing where like they just introduce him as the gruff loner, and then maybe there's a reveal later on. Here it's like, no, we're just going to show you up front, like this is why he is the way he is. And just kind of like, I think that's a way that they just immediately kind of pull you to his side to give a sense of like, yeah, he's a loner. He's kind of an asshole. He is just like really taciturn and doesn't always make like the warmest or like sensitive decisions, but like, how he got there, and you're kind of hoping that this kind of serves as something of a redemption arc for him, which, if I had to guess, I'm guessing is probably going to be the case. Like it's, there's not, in terms of like the large story arcs with this, I don't think this is necessarily going to be anything that like, and it might, but like, like a lot of these long arcs are things that we've seen before, but I think where the Last of Us really excels is in the smaller stories and the smaller moments. And I think that's a really, it's a good segue into episode 3, a long time, which is, I'm like a month behind on this show. And honestly, it wasn't from like a lack necessarily of time or of like interest. It was, I kept hearing everybody talk about what a gut punch this episode was. And I needed to, honestly, I needed to brace myself. I needed to be in a headspace where I'd be willing to kind of go through that. Because to a person, everybody who talked about this episode has said like, you are going to cry. And and spoiler alert, I did like really hard for a solid like the last third of this show, of this episode. So yeah, Derek, you're I think ahead of me, so you've definitely seen this episode, right?
Yep. Yeah, I'm currently 6 episodes in, and yeah, this was one too that we didn't watch. We kind of like, we were on vacation at the time and we're like, okay, we really, grandma's with, I don't know if we want to get into like, this is going to be really sad and emotional. And so we kind of also did the same thing and kind of put it off. But yeah, I'd never seen like, I can't remember a time I saw so many reactions on like Twitter and social media just about like a visceral reaction to an episode of television. And again, it kind of takes you back to like the, like the Sopranos days, or like early Walking Dead, or like when everyone was or Lost, where everyone was like, holy crap, this episode.
Mm-hmm.
But this one, it felt like it just really cut deep on such an emotional level, and it did not, like, yeah, it lived up to that hype when we watched it, because it was like, oh wow, it
Mm-hmm.
was like a movie. It could exist as its own on a movie. And I was talking to my friend Zach about it too, and he was saying, like, I think that's like the best episode of TV I've just seen like in the last decade, because like it's, how can you not, appreciate it just on those merits of
It's
like,
up there.
wow, that's just amazing,
Absolutely. And
and
honestly,
and then
it's 75 minutes long, so it's just
it's,
about enough to be a feature length movie.
yeah, it almost like I wish we could have had more time with those characters too, because like I could have done like a whole mini series with just Bill and Frank, because it's such a great dynamic, and they feel so lived in too, and the chemistry that they have, and those, I can only imagine, like, it just feels like something they had such a natural chemistry together, like something they would have rehearsed for, like, like 2 weeks back in the 80s, when you'd like make a movie and have 2 weeks to rehearse it ahead of time, and like,
Mm-hmm.
they just did such a tremendous job. But yeah,
Yeah,
they did not hold back.
and big credit to writer of this episode, Craig Mazin, one of the creators of the show, because from what I've read, this was actually one of the first big like divergences from the video game itself. I haven't played the video game, so like I can't necessarily talk to that, but this is the first time where they really took the story and did something on their own with it. For those who haven't seen the episode, it's a framing reference where the main characters, Pedro Pascal's Joel, and Bella Ramsey, I believe her name is Bella Ramsey's character Ellie, are kind of on this. They've started this road trip. Ellie is she's a character and a MacGuffin in that, like, she is one of the people or she's maybe the first person who seems to be immune to the fungus, because she's been bitten, but it's not taking her over. So they're on this, this journey to get her to some group who might be able to like help her and see what they can do about making a cure. And so the first stop is like they need a vehicle. So they are going to this compound to see Bill and Frank. And Bill and Frank are they kind of shoot back, or they flash back to the early days of the pandemic, where we meet Bill, played by Nick Offerman, who is this radical survivalist. He's got like a whole bunker in his basement with like security cameras. Like he's got like the Burt Gummer wall of guns.
Oh my gosh,
like from Tremors. And he's very antisocial. We meet him where you see like the military starting to round people up and take them either to quarantines or to like mass killing fields if there's not room for the quarantines. So you see him kind of sitting there and just kind of like very smug in his position. You see him thriving, like, in a way. He's able to build a fence around his neighborhood. He's able to get supplies. He's got a generator. He's got everything he needs, but he's alone, which is how he likes it. Until he comes across on his property Frank, played by Murray Bartlett, who I think Murray Bartlett is kind of like one of the unsung heroes of like prestige television right now. I actually remember him. The first thing I saw him in was another HBO show called Looking, back in like I think like the early 2010s or something like that. But of course, he made a big splash in The White Lotus, the first season of White Lotus, as like the manic manager of the resort. So you kind of keep seeing him pop up, and he plays Frank here, and Frank is traveling from Baltimore, and he winds up falling into like one of Bill's traps, and Bill, kind of reluctantly brings him in and gives him food. And they pretty quickly realize that they're attracted to one another. And this is something that Bill is conflicted with, because you get the idea that he never really faced that part of himself, the fact that, that he was queer. And so it turns into kind of this like slices of their life episode, where they'll do these time jumps, because they're starting early in the pandemic in like 2003. And I think where where this episode really excels is in terms of like it's subverting expectations, because they're setting up this like bittersweet same-sex romance in the time of, you know, zombies, or you know, zombies, and like, you know, all of the stuff that comes with that. So raiders, you know, people who, like, lots of ways for people to die. So you think that's kind of gonna be the way they go, and they tease you with that. There's a whole sequence where like they get attacked, Bill gets shot, you think maybe he's gonna die. And where this episode really just like ruined me is where you see the pivot and you realize that like that's not what this story is. That's not how this story ends. It skips to them like well into old age. Like I would say probably what, like late 60s, early 70s, something like that, if you're looking at the timeline. And they skip to the point where Frank has some kind of unnamed terminal illness. They talk about it. They says like this wasn't curable before the outbreak, so like I'm not going to survive this. And like there's this whole sequence where, and I think there's a really interesting conversation here about like assisted suicide, because Frank, like knowing, seeing the writing on the wall, says, I want to have one really last good day with you, and then I want you to put a bunch of sleeping pills into my wine and let me go. And of course, this like tears Bill apart, and he goes along with it. And it's kind of one of those things where it's like, as I see this scene playing out, where they're going through this great day together, they're sitting down to dinner, you see Bill kind of like going along with it, putting the sleeping pills in his drink. Like there's that little voice in the back of your head. It's like, you know what's going to happen here, right? And sure enough, like without telling Frank, Bill also medicated his own wine. And it's this very bittersweet moment where it's like, you know, you could, in one side, you could see this as tragic. You could see it as, you know, someone like, you know, taking this very like, you know, melodramatic way out. I think, but I think the line, and I'm paraphrasing, is where Bill says, like, this isn't some tragic ending. Like, I am satisfied. You were my reason for living at this point, and like, I don't have one after this. And I think, I don't know, like, I'm sure there's going to be some conflicting emotions from people about like whether or not that was like the coward's way out, or whether or not it was like, you know, too melodramatic. But I don't know. I think there's a very interesting conversation here about like giving people the opportunity to go out in their own terms, you know, and I don't mean that callously in terms of like, you know, just let people commit suicide or something like that. But, you know, I think there are points in people's lives, especially at the end of their lives, where like we get very hung up on the idea of quality of life, or no, we get hung up on the idea of life over quality of life, you know. And I think there's something to be said about having a conversation about like, when does a person be able to say like, no, I'm good, that's enough for me. And I think they take that a very like understated and beautiful place in this episode. And so I just like I said, I think the entire final 20 to 25 minutes of this show, I was weeping. Just like, and not like single tear coming down, like ugly sobs. Yeah.
Like just let it all out, sobs. Full on. Yeah. It's, and how can he, I mean, it just, it's such a bittersweet moment, because it's tragic, but at the same time, it's also like a happy moment, depending on how you look at it, because it's like,
they
like
had
you said,
life.
Right. Yeah. It's them, and it's him embracing that love with Frank and wanting to kind of go out with it, you know, and it's so at this, and even Frank kind of admits, he's like, I don't endorse this, but I can't like deny that it's very romantic, you know. So he gets it too, even though like he obviously, you know, part of him probably wants Bill to live on, but at the same time, you know, they're both of this certain age, they're living in this very very brutal world, where it's probably getting harder to defend yourself against raiders and that kind of thing. So yeah, there's a lot of layers to that, but it just kind of cuts right to the emotion of it though, and it's so genuine and beautiful and but very very sad at the same time. But
Mm-hmm.
it's like sad because it's so beautiful. Like
It's
I don't know,
bittersweet.
it's like he won, like they're both dying, but it's like they also won the lottery in the apocalypse just by finding each other and having
Mm-hmm.
like carving out their own area in the world when so many other people were either infected or like just Joel, where they're just barely getting by and like very bitter. Like they actually found some kind of happiness, and they're like preserving that, right up until the end, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to, whatever Bill's life would have looked like after that. So it's heavy stuff. Like,
Mm-hmm.
holy crap.
But just
Like,
so well done.
yeah, so well done. And the final shot too, like, so then after that, you don't, I think it's like maybe a couple of months after they both go to the bedroom
Yeah,
and, they're going,
they don't really, some amount of time has gone
yeah.
by. It's not like the next day.
No, yeah, because but that line, like, yeah, Bill leaves this letter for Joel, and he kind of explains a little bit of what happened, but uh, and it also kind of gives Joel something to think about too, because he kind of says he thinks it's about Tess, Bill does, because he's never met Ellie, but he
Mm,
says, like, if you find, he kind of makes Joel realize that if you have someone in your life, worth protecting, or, that gives your life meaning, like that's your purpose now. So he kind
yeah,
of, in a way that all kind of motivates Joel and kind of, brings him and Ellie closer together, even though it's also even more devastating, because then you're like,
that
oh
one final
crap,
gut
Tess is
punch. Yeah.
like, Tess is dead too now. And so it's a lot of emotion. But that final shot though of the window being open, because they wanted, they
Yeah.
were anticipating what would happen with decomposition and
Hmm.
everything. And but that shot, and not showing them too, like, just there's no reason to, like, just showing
What's
the
in there.
window is enough. Yeah.
Hmm.
And not opening the bedroom door. Like, I thought it was just so beautifully handled. And it was, yeah, just, it's just a masterpiece when you think about it. It's on so many levels, and it would be hard to rewatch it because it is so sad, but also, like, it's something that should be rewatched, I think, just because there's so much to draw from that episode and those
Absolutely.
performances.
Yeah. No, I
So
think like if I ever need like a cathartic like afternoon or something like that, I'll just pop that on, and I don't think that's gonna fail.
yeah, just have something lighter kind of queued up for afterwards. But
Hmm. But I, like
maybe,
an idiot, just went into episode 4.
oh, right after, so like
Yep.
you got
Hmm.
done crying, and then you put the tissues away and went right into episode 4
Yeah, which
of the
is setting up some more interesting stuff. Like, we're not
yeah.
gonna. I don't think we're gonna do like an episode by episode through like 6, but I think um, the really interesting thing we're getting from 4 is establishing this new kind of very dangerous character, Kathleen, played by Melanie Linsky. She
Mm-hmm.
is clearly very smart. She is very, in some ways, like very sensitive, and like she's not cold, but she's vengeful. She is. We meet her interrogating someone, and you get kind of like through. They do a good job at like giving you hints of exposition where Fedra had killed her brother, like tortured and killed her brother, and she is after the people who she sees as responsible for giving her brother up to Fedra. And she
Yep.
is clearly obsessed. She's trying to do right by her group, but like she is obsessed with this idea of making the people who did this to her brother pay. And you keep getting hints about this guy named Sam who they're looking for. I'm guessing he's going to become like something more of a player in the other future episodes, because we finally see him at the end. But yeah, it's interesting that it's adding this whole new interesting element to the Joel and Ellie dynamic.
Yeah, this is this is another case of the show kind of expanding the world of the video game, because while Henry and Sam are from the video game, to my knowledge, Kathleen is not. And so that was, but the whole circumstances that they're in when they get to the city and they're kind of attacked by raiders and everything, like that exists, but they did a really good job of kind of giving a face to the raiders and kind of like giving them a purpose for what they're doing. And the whole like element of like Kansas City being under Fedra control, but also like they just overturned the government there and like kind of took control of the city, and then putting Joel and Ellie like right in the middle of all that. That's so fascinating. And I think it actually improves upon the story in the game, where it like gives a little more meaning to everything. And I think, you know, especially with the characters that we're seeing, that you're seeing for the first time. And yeah, it's a really, and I like too how we were in the country and now we're back in the city, so we're getting like these different environments. But Melanie Linsky, though, I've always been a fan of hers, and she's so menacing in this show, but like in a soft spoken way, and which is even more chilling. And I just love that it feels like there was a whole movie that happened before we even got there. So it kind of like, you can tell that the writers of the show, I can imagine they would have like some kind of character Bible, and like there's just like a whole chapter to Kathleen, and like even like her second in command and everything. But yeah, it's I'm excited for you to see what's next, because episode 5, there's some interesting things that are about to go down. But
I'm told I should once again carry a box of tissues into that episode as well.
Yeah, in
a different kind of way, like not in exactly the same way, but yeah, there's some more moments coming up from what I've heard.
Yeah, it's not exactly the feel good show of the year by any means. And I guess with the video game was the same way, where it was like, oh wow, they did that. Like I didn't know you could do that in a video game, you know, where like it, and you know, there's always been like more violent and intense video games, but just like, I don't know, the way they wrote the video game kind of in this very cinematic way, it almost felt like you're watching a movie sometimes. And then, but they still were like doing these really gritty things. And so the TV series is definitely kind of doubling down on that, but fleshing it out in really cool ways. So, and there's some really interesting, like the more diving into some of the zombies and different types of zombies. So I'm excited for you to see that too, because there's you know, being that the apocalypse has been going on for like 20 years, it's kind of like it's kind of like that world where like there's different types of zombies and they've kind of aged differently, and you know, it's going to get interesting. So but I don't want to give too much away, but there are some like I mentioned in a previous episode, there's some of those World War Z vibes with the kind of how the zombies work together like ants and things like that. So a little different than the World War Z movie, but a little more grim, I guess you could say.
Well, would you recommend, because I just realized that they released like a remastered Last of Us video game. Would you recommend checking that out as part of this experience?
I definitely would. And that's the only version I've played, is so I can't, I think it's you know, it's definitely remastered and kind of, you know, because they knew they're coming out with a part 2, so I think they kind of tied it together a little bit. But the graphics are amazing, and I think you would enjoy it a lot, because, well, one, I know you're a very avid video gamer, like, and you love a good video game story, and I think it just doesn't get much better than that when just looking at playing the game. And it's a really fun type of survival horror too, where it's a good mix of, okay, you're doing some like RPG where you're in a shootout, but then like, okay, you have to also make sure that you don't shoot all your ammo, because that's hard to come by, and you have to like customize your guns, so you have to find duct tape. And we're always like in the show, we're looking for like red toolboxes and pliers, because in the game that's like, ooh, now you can like customize your rifle more because you found a red pliers, and you can you're like, oh sweet, we can put it.
Clearly all you need to upgrade like an automatic weapon is a pair of red pliers.
Right. I mean, it's one of the greatest things too is like you spend like you collect nuts and bolts in the video game as like your currency to like customize your weapons. So like you spend
like your materials kind of thing.
Yeah, your materials, and you like spend 30 nuts and bolts to like add a couple more cartridges to a gun, but all Joel does is like polish the gun with a rag, and it's like, all right, there you go. Now you can shoot 2 more shells in that. but it's really cool though. It's I would definitely recommend it. And nice. Maybe after the first season is over, like so that it's not spoiled, like if you end up going past it in the game, or I guess you could just play the game and kind of pace yourself too behind what's going on right now in the show. But
it'll take me a while to get through it. So
it might be what was the game? Was it Dark Souls?
Dark Souls, Elden Ring, like
that you played for about a decade.
Each of those games, I put in about 150 hours a piece on those.
Whew.
Yeah,
wow, man, that's intense. Yeah, that's and we were able to finish the story. I think we probably put like 30 to 40 hours in it. Okay. But then it got to the point where it was so addicting that we just like, okay, we're gonna play for like 8 to 10 hours today, and like just. But there's moments where it's hard to get back. Yeah, just binged it. So nothing as difficult as fighting Daddy with the chainsaw in Biohazard Resident Evil, but almost that level where I spent like a week trying to get past that.
Okay,
but good stuff. So, but yeah, we'll have to check in on another episode as we continue our journey.
Yeah, I'm sure there's more updates to come.
Yes, it is also the year of Pedro Pascal because the Mandalorian is back now too. So he's the king of he's the king of playing reluctant parental guardians in these shows. So it's really fun to see him doing well. But so in addition to The Last of Us, I also recently made it to the movie theater to
very nice
see a certain kind of cinema that just came out, and that is Cocaine Bear.
Very nice.
Which I think I first saw the trailer for this when we saw Violent Night in theaters, and it was one of those movies where it's like, okay, yeah, this is going to have to be a must see at some point. Even though I almost wish I hadn't seen the trailer because it showed so much.
Yeah,
but it definitely lived up to what they promised. So if you're unfamiliar, listeners, with Cocaine Bear, not to be confused with Meth Gator, which is coming soon from the asylum.
And Cocaine Bear, not Meth Gator, loosely based on a true story, if I remember correctly, right?
Yes, which is, I know, I kind of went down the Wikipedia rabbit hole on this because yes, while the events of the movie are largely fictitious, it really, like, the basis for this movie really happened. And that's so in 1985, this drug dealer, Andrew C. Thornton II, he was,
that is a name.
It really is. It's very distinguished, but he was like the leader of this drug smuggling operation in Kentucky. And so in 1985, he was coming back from Colombia. They had like this plane on autopilot, and they were literally dumping like duffel bags of cocaine as they were flying over the woods so that other drug dealers could come later and kind of pick it up, something like that. And Thornton ended up when he parachuted out of the plane, because they're also like parachuting out of the plane with all this cocaine, he ended up basically falling to his death. Like his parachute didn't quite work out the way it was supposed to. So him and some cocaine ended up falling in this guy's driveway, like this 85-year-old's driveway in Kentucky. And so that is kind of like the base. That's what the jumping off point of the movie. And in the movie, he just like hits his head on the door as he's jumping out, and then so that's why he does it. So that's kind of their explanation of why he didn't make it. But in the meantime, there's all this cocaine in this like national forest, Chattahoochee National Forest. So you've got all these different characters kind of coming across the cocaine. But before anybody can get to it, this giant black bear starts eating the cocaine, like just eating the kilos that it finds in the woods. And it kind of develops a taste for it because the black bear just continually is searching for more cocaine. So it's like addicted to it. And in the process, coming across all these different characters. So you've got a couple of kids who are playing hooky from school. You've got the mom chasing down one of the kids, played by Carrie Russell. You have a couple of drug dealers, including O'Shea Jackson Jr., who are kind of sent by their mob boss, played by the late great Ray Liotta, in one of his final film roles. And so they're looking for the cocaine. Then you have the park ranger, who has a crush on like the wildlife specialist who's visiting that day. And and a gang of like 18-year-olds who are like these they seem like straight out of like a Canadian 80s movie. But they're like terrorizing the forest because they've been like mugging people with pocket knives. So that's like and then of course you have like your campers and tourists who are just walking through the woods. So it's just like such a great setting for a movie like this, because you have all these different characters from all different walks of life. And the bear, as it eats the cocaine, gets like kind of like a super hyper dog where it just like moves really quickly and like just starts like very unpredictably attacking people. But it's a trip. It's very interesting.
I mean, judging by the trailer, this is a movie that knows very much what it is. And
yes,
like, I'm hoping they lean into that in the movie itself.
That's it. That's a perfect way to put it, because so Elizabeth Banks directed the movie, and she of course comes from like a great comedy background as well. And it's funny because we're big fans of Wet Hot American Summer, and the first song that comes on in Cocaine Bear is Jane by Jefferson Starship. And my friend Zach and I just looked at each other and were like, okay, we know exactly what kind of a movie we're getting into. And it kind of had, even though it's not as like Wet Hot American Summer goes into like a different direction, it still kind of has those same like really quirky characters that
like
just
that
are
manic,
like
surreal feeling to it, where it's just like, this is almost like a couple degrees out of reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because in real life, a bear did find the cocaine, but it just kind of died after ingesting it. So they're like, okay, let's take that one step further and make it into like this murderous machine that's like super abilities, because it can move so quickly, because like the cocaine is like this enhancer of its natural abilities. And then of course people that think they know how to deal with a bear, like a normal bear, they are like just mauled because it's not a normal bear.
Yeah.
But there's it's really predominantly a comedy, more than, it's not necessarily like the animal attacks movies from the 70s, which I was expecting a little more of that vibe.
So this isn't quite Grizzly. This isn't William Adler's Grizzly.
No, it's not quite Girdler territory from what I've heard, but it still gets like, it really earns its R rating. They do not when they get into the attacks, because they kind of build up to it a little bit, because at first they kind of take the Jaws approach or the Girdler Grizzly approach, where they don't really show the bears more like in the bushes and like people are getting dragged off camera. But then like about halfway through the movie, they just start showing everything, and it just turns into a bloodbath. It's so it is interesting how they handle the violence, because you kind of feel like you're watching like an Adam McKay, like Will Ferrell movie from like the early 2000s, but then all of a sudden, like
it's not.
The Will Ferrell character gets like his head bit off, you know. So it's, and the soundtrack, like they really selected, like they kind of cherry pick songs to fit certain different bear attacks, and like it's so 80s, it's so much fun. There's like adaptation modes, like just can't get enough, like as the bear's like chasing after the ambulance, and it knows exactly what it is. Just the movie. And I almost, my one gripe with it is I almost feel like it peaks like in the middle, like
then kind of like tapers off, or like peters
like
out.
They just didn't quite know what to do with it in the third act. They add some interesting elements and things like that, but I feel like it just, I don't know, there's a scene in the middle of the movie where it's like, I don't know how you can top that. And I almost feel like maybe that should have been the climax, but it's still a lot of fun. And yeah, I would give it a solid, if I had to rate it out of 5, I would give it like probably 3.5 cocaine cubs out of 5. So
that's a solid amount of cocaine cubs.
But you got to know what you're getting into too. I mean, if you go in kind of expecting a certain type of cinema, then
if you go into a movie called Cocaine Bear and you don't know what you're getting into, that's on you.
I think that's fair. So we'll see if there's going to be a sequel. I'm not sure, but
Cocaine Bears, they're going to go like the aliens route. It's going to be an entire forest of coked up bears.
And with Meth Gator coming out, you could eventually do like a Godzilla versus Kong. I just love how we're getting
like versus Meth Gator. Yep,
we're doing like Sharknado all over again now, where we're like immediately getting this kind of a knockoff version. Yeah. And it's an exciting time to be a film fan. So
is it though?
But yeah,
like I'm all for Cocaine Bear, but I think Meth Gator I'll take a big pass on.
Well, yeah, I'm guessing it won't be our next live stream, but you never know. Well, first we'll watch Santa Jaws, and then we'll see. So that was my Cocaine Bear experience, and but I understand it's not all watching on this podcast. I know we've recently been doing some Corpse Club book club segments on the show.
Yes, absolutely.
And I understand that you have something that you've read recently that you really got to sink your teeth into.
I guess I should have seen that coming. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about a graphic novel called Fangs by Sarah Andersen. She is a cartoonist and illustrator, and she put together this story about a vampire named Elsie. She's 300 years old, and she meets Jimmy, who is a werewolf. And it's basically like a very sweet horror rom-com. This was actually introduced to me by one of my loved ones who's not like super into horror, but she knows like I'm a really big fan, and so like I've tried to like find ways to coax her into the genre a little bit, and she introduced this to me, and I think it's a really good example of like horror doesn't have to be like, oh yeah, and then like the bad guy reached down the person's throat and ripped his balls out through his mouth. Like it doesn't have to be like bleak. It doesn't have to be over the top. I love over the top, and in some cases I like bleak. I appreciate it, but horror can be a very versatile genre. You can do horror comedy, you can do horror action, and in this case, in the case of Fangs, you can do a really good horror rom-com, which is essentially what this is. And it's set up really well because it is like you need to know very little about this going into it. Like it picks up right as they're meeting, and it's just a series of slice of life little, like it's almost like a bunch of comic strips that make up this whole book. And nice. So as long as you know that Elsie is a vampire and Jimmy is a werewolf, you could turn to any page of this thing and know what's going on, and 95% of the time get the joke.
Oh, nice.
And it's very sweet, it's very charming, but it's got a little bit of a bite to it. Yeah,
Oh,
hey,
you can
it's
play at this game.
yeah. I mean, if we're gonna do bad puns, let's go for it. But it's like, they don't shy away from the fact that like Elsie's killed a bunch of people, and by the time like we come into the movie,
Mm.
like they talk about how she's gone quote unquote vegan by only taking blood from blood banks. Like she doesn't kill people anymore, but like she isn't like sad about it. Like she's, it's just what she has done, and she worships like Lucifer. Like there's just lots of little, because like a lot of this is about the ways in which that they're different and complement each other. So like there's this thing where like in the same panels that you find out she, worships Satan, you get the sense, or like Jimmy is talking about, he's not religious, but he's spiritual. He's very into the moon, like that kind of thing. So it's like a lot of very tongue-in-cheek kind of humor. It's very sweet, it's very silly, but yeah, it's also not like um I don't know, it's not like diluted, it doesn't feel like. And yeah, I think it's a really good example of like a lot of different things of the versatility of horror. It's a good example of like uh graphic novels in a way that like doesn't need to be like intimidating, because I know,
Yeah.
for me with a lot of like especially like long running graphic novels, it's like what the hell's my entry point on this, and so this
Volume
is like,
20.
yeah, and this is just like you can pick up this book and theoretically probably read it in about a half hour.
Oh,
That,
wow.
it's not super
And
loaded in terms of like being dense, but it's still a really worthwhile experience. It's just not something you
mhm.
need to devote like tons of time to.
That is really cool. And I saw too, you held up to the camera the like the hardcover of it. It's a gorgeous looking book too. It kind of reminds me of something you would see like in a Victorian library, that red
Absolutely.
velvety kind of cover.
Yeah,
And
yeah, it's got, and I'm showing it on the cameras if anybody's going to see this, but it's yeah, it's got kind of like that old time feel to it, like almost something you could like put as like a little coffee table book too, like something that
ooh,
like
that's fun.
looks good and like someone could just pick it up and like leaf through it and be like, oh, it's just something that like, yeah, it's a good little what's the word I'm looking for, like an amuse bouche of horror for people who would be into it.
Ooh, the word of the day. Well, I like that too, though, like how it's not necessarily like you have to start on page one kind of thing, because I grew up reading like the collected Garfield comic strips, and yeah, there would be sometimes like the week would have a continuing story, but it was kind of fun to just like flip through and be like, oh, this is like and you get to know the characters, so you kind of are like you kind of know by the time you get halfway through the book, like, oh, I can just go to anywhere in this book and enjoy like a page or two of their day-to-day lives.
Mhm.
So that sounds really cool and appealing. And also like, yeah, I'm just looking at one of the preview pages on Amazon, and it's like she's stressing out over like her journal entry, and it says eat him pro cons, and then it's
Oh
date
yeah,
him pros and
yeah,
cons.
and it's
Oh my
also very
gosh.
like, I wouldn't say it's necessarily minimalist, but it's like it's in black and white.
Oh, cool.
It's like really good like sketch work. It's
Mm.
just like it's good at getting the point across without having to be like overly flamboyant about it.
Like there's like a minimalism to it, but
Yeah,
not overly so, but
yeah,
it's very
yeah.
like easy to look at and
It's
everything. And
it's not too much, but it's also not like, like void of
mm,
character kind of thing. Yeah.
gotcha, like more broad stroke kind of stuff.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it's would you say that it has, because it is dealing with like vampires, werewolves, does it have kind of like a What We Do in the Shadows vibe to it, where it's like, yes, they eat people, but also, so like there is real kind of, there's like a real sense of danger in what they do, but it's also like very funny and natural.
I don't think necessarily that level of danger is there in What We Do in the
Okay.
Shadows. And also it's funny, for as given the fact that they're little literal cartoons, they're still less cartoony than the characters from What We Do in the Shadows. Like they're more subdued in terms of like their approach to these characters. But yeah, I think Anderson's put together something that's just really, really charming with this graphic novel. It's really good.
Nice. Nice. And well, I'm going to be sure to check this out too, because, and I've, never, I'm not familiar with Sarah Andersen's work. So I'm always excited to kind of add a new person to the to read list, especially like in the realm of graphic novels, because there's so much to choose from. It's good to know like someone you trust when they enjoy something. It's like, oh, sweet. Okay, that's going up on the to read pile above like 250 other things.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, and I am, if you listen to one of our previous episodes, I was in the process of reading Paul Tremblay's The Cabin at the End of the World. And I finally got around to finishing reading it. And lo and behold, a movie version of it came out as well in that span of time. Now, if you're wondering, well, the movie has a slightly different title. It's called Knock at the Cabin, even though I think The Cabin at the End of the World would have been a pretty awesome title just for the movie itself. Maybe a little less room on the poster, but but M. Night Shyamalan did a movie adaptation, which I have not gotten around to seeing yet. I guess I was too busy watching Cocaine Bear, but
as one does.
I do it as one does. But I did have a chance to read the book it's based on, and it's I won't go into spoilers and for those unfamiliar with The Cabin at the End of the World, but I will say that Paul Tremblay did a really tremendous job with the book front to back. It's like it's about, I think it's like 270-ish pages, but it really goes by quickly. It's a page turner. I think once you get into it, I think you could finish it in a couple of days. If you have like if you have a couple uninterrupted segments of reading time, because I was reading it on a plane, so I got to kind of dive in, and then I watched Matchstick Men because I was like, ooh, they actually have like an early 2000s Nicolas Cage movie on the plane. So, but anyway, it is just. So for those unfamiliar with the book, basically it follows this couple, Andrew and Eric, and their adopted 7-year-old daughter, Wen, who they're like on vacation at this very isolated cabin in the woods in Massachusetts, or somewhere in the northeastern United States. And basically these 4 strangers show up at their door, and they've never seen they don't think they've ever met. They're like, who are these people? We don't know them. And basically these 4 people are like, hey, we're here to prevent the end of the world. And the only way to do that is one of you has to sacrifice yourselves and like basically either commit suicide or be killed by the other 2 of you. And so basically you have to choose which one of you are going to be sacrificed, and if you don't, then the world's going to end. And it's like, okay, that's a really intense question. So basically it's kind of like this kind of turns into like this home invasion thriller, because they're basically being kept hostage, and there's this really real sense of ambiguity as to whether or not, because at first you're like, well, they, these people are, they're like, they're psychotic. How can this be true? But there's this ambiguity of like, because there is a television set in the cabin, and there's like that every day that goes by where they don't make the choice, they're like kind of pointing at like, well, this happened in this part of the world, and like things. So they're like, okay, it gets a little eerie, because you're like, wait a minute, is this coincidence, or are they actually telling the truth? And I think what Tremblay does a really interesting job of is like the 4 strangers, they're like convinced that they have no choice, like that they're like, say they admit to their captors that they don't want to be there, like they tried to resist coming there, but like they're just being driven to go there by like visions that they've had. And like, so it really walks this line of like, okay, who's telling the truth? And at the longer this goes on, like one of I believe it's Eric, kind of starts to like really buy into like, okay, maybe we do have to make a choice. And so it's really intense. It's kind of like it taps into The Last of Us in the sense that it's very like gritty and realistic, and it's a very kind of out there idea, but it's handled with a really real sense of realism that makes it really unsettling. And yeah, it just kind of goes from there. But I will say that it's definitely one I would recommend if you kind of like a twisty, kind of like a home invasion meets psychological thriller kind of vibe to it. So
Interesting.
I know that, yeah. So it's definitely one I'd recommend. I've also read A Head Full of Ghosts that Tremblay wrote like in 2015. That one's also really, really good. Kind of deals with the same sort of ambiguity, but that one deals with like an exorcism. That's documented by like a TV crew. So,
oh wow,
yeah. So he does. He's got really interesting ideas. So, I will say The Cabinet at the End of the World does have some like really kind of at times it gets very violent. So that is something to keep in mind. But it's also done. It's not like it all serves the story, and it's not kind of like I don't know. It's done in a yeah. It's
or it doesn't feel exploitative.
Right. So it's handled in a way that I think is approachable, even if you don't usually read that kind of thing. So yeah, that's The Cabinet at the End of the World, and hopefully sometime. I know it's on digital now too, but I hope to see Knock at the Cabin at some point, because Dave Bautista and Rupert Grint definitely looks like it'd be a very interesting cast, and I actually had a chance to watch old M. Night Shyamalan's Old for the first time, and I enjoyed that a lot, quite a bit actually, way more than I thought I would, because it was so polarizing when it came out. But it was like it just kind of felt like a lost episode of Lost, but like on like speed. So
on cocaine.
Yeah, honestly, yeah. I mean, I think it would have been that would have been Cocaine Polar Bear if it was like a Lost episode, but
Cocaine Smoke Monster.
Oh yeah, there you go. I mean, just any situation you can think of, if you just add a kilo of cocaine to it,
just
it's going to be even more intense.
Yeah.
Like The Last of Us zombies, but with cocaine. Which
I feel like is the idea that someone on cocaine would come up with.
Right. I mean, it's only natural. It's science.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my goodness. Well, I think that is going to bring us to the end of this episode of Corpse Club. We've covered The Last of Us. We've some gut-wrenching emotional moments. We've gone to Cocaine Bear Land, and we wrap things up with our book club.
Worst amusement park ever, Cocaine Bear Land.
Yeah, definitely one to bring the kids to. It's at your own peril. Not sure if the seatbelts on the roller coaster would work at that place, but
well, no, they don't have seatbelts. That way you can get out and run away from the cocaine bear.
See, thinking ahead.
Yep,
that's the cocaine brain. Well, we want to, as we wrap things up, thank you, Bryan, for joining me, and we also want to thank the other Bryan, our engineer, for helping us out every episode. And as always, we want to thank you, our listeners, including those of you who have signed up for a Corpse Club membership. Make sure to visit corpseclub.com to check out our latest episode. You can also sign up to become a member, which will give you access to all sorts of ghoulish goodies, from our t-shirt and pin to the ability to suggest an episode. And we also have a bunch of commentaries of movies for our members that are exclusive to Corpse Club members. So be sure to check those out as well. Don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Every rating and review really does help. You can also find us on Google Play, SoundCloud, and all of your favorite podcast providers. If you want to get in touch, you can reach us anytime at contact@corpseclub.com, or on Twitter @DailyDeadNews or @Corpse Club, and on Instagram and Facebook under Corpse Club. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay scary.